The desert was quiet, almost unnervingly so, as Specialist Jessica Monroe stepped off the transport helicopter. The rotor's echo still hummed in her ears, blending with the wind that swept across the endless expanse of sand, rocks, and distant ridges. Nevada's desert was no stranger to soldiers, but even seasoned veterans often admitted that this particular training ground could break the strongest minds and bodies. At 28, Jessica had already endured years of combat deployments and rigorous medical training. But this exercise was different. It wasn't about bullets, explosions, or enemy combatants. It was about survival. Pure, unadulterated survival in one of the most unforgiving terrains on the planet. She adjusted the straps of her rucksack, feeling the familiar weight settle across her shoulders. Inside were the bare essentials: a combat knife, a compass, a small first aid kit, a few rations, and a single flint for fire. Water, the most precious resource in any desert, was not included. That, the commanders explained, was the point. For 72 hours, she would rely entirely on her skills, instincts, and resilience. Failure was not punished with death in this training scenario, but the humiliation of quitting or being airlifted out would sting long after the exercise ended. As the helicopter lifted away, leaving her standing alone in the heat, she took a deep breath, savoring the moment of absolute solitude. The wind carried fine grains of sand, stinging her exposed skin. The sun had already risen higher than she anticipated, glaring down like a relentless spotlight, baking the earth below. She could feel the sweat pooling in her hairline, dripping down her back despite the early hour. Her shadow stretched long across the sand, thin and fragile, in contrast to the vastness that surrounded her. Jessica had trained for this moment for months, reviewing survival manuals, studying desert ecosystems, practicing water-finding techniques, and running through emergency drills. She knew the basics: move carefully, ration energy, travel under cover of night when possible, find shade during the blistering days, and always keep a clear head. Yet nothing could fully prepare her for the raw, overwhelming silence of the desert, nor for the immense pressure of relying entirely on herself. The first step was always the hardest. Her boots sank into the hot sand as she began moving toward a rocky outcrop she had spotted a few hundred meters away. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the sand itself were conspiring to hold her down. She reminded herself of her objective: reach the safe zone before sunset, find a shaded area, and set up minimal shelter. Every movement was measured, deliberate, conserving precious energy. She forced herself to focus on the rhythm of her breathing, slow and steady, trying to drown out the hammering of her pulse in her ears. Hours passed. The heat rose with the sun, the air shimmering in wavering waves that made distant rocks appear to dance. Jessica's mouth felt parched, dry enough that each swallow of saliva was an effort. She tried to keep her mind busy, counting steps, analyzing the landscape, planning her route for the evening. But the desert seemed endless, and with each passing hour, a creeping awareness of vulnerability settled over her. The sun's glare reflected off the sand so sharply that her eyes watered despite her protective goggles. She could feel the beginnings of sunburn on her neck and arms, already darkened by previous deployments. Her training included improvisation, and Jessica soon began putting it into practice. She scavenged for shade where she could, using boulders and canyon walls as temporary refuges. She applied her knife to cut small grooves in the rocks, to collect condensation overnight, hoping for just a few precious drops of water. The desert offered little reward for ingenuity, but every minor success boosted her confidence, reaffirming that she could endure longer than she ever thought possible. By late afternoon, the desert revealed another challenge: navigation. The endless dunes made it easy to lose direction. Jessica pulled out her compass, aligning it carefully with the sun's position. cross-referencing the landmarks she had memorized during reconnaissance flights. She moved cautiously, mindful that a single wrong step could waste energy and leave her stranded in the wrong sector, far from potential rescue or shelter. Her mind ran through worst-case scenarios, each one more daunting than the last, but she refused to give in to panic. Panic, she reminded herself, would be far deadlier than hunger or thirst. As evening approached, the temperature dropped slightly, bringing fleeting relief. Shadows lengthened, creating hidden crevices and deceptive hollows. Jessica pressed forward, scanning constantly for snakes, scorpions, and other desert predators. She kept her knife ready, not for combat, but as a tool to dig, to cut, to protect herself from anything unforeseen. Each step was calculated, her awareness hyper-focused on both terrain and survival principles. Her body was tired, but her mind was sharpened by the urgency of isolation. Night in the desert brought another form of challenge. The temperature plummeted, starkly contrasting the daytime inferno. Jessica layered herself with her jacket and improvised blanket, shivering despite exhaustion. She built a small fire, carefully concealed to avoid detection by others on separate exercises, its smoke curling into the star-speckled sky. She sat beside it, sipping from the meager rations she carried, her stomach protesting but understanding that sustenance was secondary to survival at this stage. As she stared into the flames, she thought about the irony. How the desert, a place of so little life, could feel more alive than any battlefield she had known. Sleep came fitfully, plagued by heat, cold, and the constant awareness of vulnerability. Every noise, a distant howl, a shifting dune, the whisper of wind, jolted her awake. But the training was designed to simulate real survival situations, and she forced herself to rest. Her mind replayed lessons she had learned over years of medical training and military discipline, reminding her that clarity of thought, even in exhaustion, could mean the difference between life and death. By dawn, Jessica was already awake, muscles stiff, body sore, yet determination fueled every movement. The desert did not forgive weakness, nor did it wait for hesitation. She pressed on, surveying the terrain, adjusting her path as necessary, and making mental notes for shelter, water sources, and potential hazards. Every step was a test of endurance, every glance a study of strategy. She had been assigned a challenge few embraced willingly, and yet, standing alone in the desert, she felt a strange exhilaration. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The assignment nobody wanted had chosen her, and she was ready. The helicopter receded into the distance, its rotors whipping sand and dust into the air, leaving Specialist Jessica Monroe standing alone in the harsh Nevada desert. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The desert, with its barren dunes, jagged rocks, and shimmering horizon, seemed endless. The sun hung high above, unrelenting, scorching the landscape with a brilliance that felt almost unnatural. Jessica adjusted her pack, the straps biting into her shoulders, and felt the weight of what she had undertaken pressing down on her, not just physically, but mentally. This was more than survival. It was a test of grit, willpower, and endurance. She stepped forward cautiously, each foot sinking slightly into the hot sand. The heat radiated from the ground, making every step feel heavier. Jessica was acutely aware of the danger surrounding her. Venomous snakes, sharp rocks, scorpions, and the ever-present threat of dehydration. Her compass and map were her only guides, but the desert's vast emptiness threatened to render them almost useless. Every rock, every dune looked identical, and without careful navigation, it would be terrifyingly easy to lose direction. Within an hour, she found herself walking through a series of small ridges and rocky outcrops. The rocks offered some shade, though barely enough to block the sun's searing rays. She crouched beneath a boulder, wiping the sweat from her brow. Her lips were already chapped, her tongue dry, but she refused to panic. Panic, she reminded herself, would accelerate dehydration, drain energy, and lead to mistakes the desert would punish mercilessly. She checked her supplies. A few small energy bars, a compact first aid kit, a flint, and her trusty combat knife. No water, not a drop. That was part of the challenge, part of the cruel beauty of this test. Jessica began moving again, deliberately pacing herself to conserve energy. She avoided the open sun when possible, ducking into shallow gullies and shadowed areas. Even small hills became obstacles, requiring more exertion than they seemed to warrant. Every movement felt like an evaluation. How much could her body endure? How far could she push herself before reaching the point of collapse? Her breathing was measured and controlled, each inhale sharp and shallow to preserve moisture, each exhale slow and deliberate to regulate energy. By late morning, the desert's challenges had intensified. Heat waves shimmered across the sand, making distant rocks appear to shift, morph, and dance. She realized she was experiencing mirages, a cruel trick of nature, and yet she had to be vigilant. One false step could lead her to waste precious energy chasing water that wasn't there, or worse, to wander into a dangerous area. Her eyes burned from the reflected sunlight, and her skin stung where the sun had begun to burn her shoulders. She dug briefly for shade under a large, flat boulder, the effort leaving her fingers raw, but the brief relief was worth it. The afternoon was merciless. Sweat poured down her back and mixed with the thin layer of sand clinging to her clothing. Each step was an effort, each breath a challenge. Jessica's mind began running through worst-case scenarios, testing herself mentally. What would she do if she ran out of food? If her feet blistered beyond repair? If dehydration overtook her before nightfall? She forced herself to focus, compartmentalizing fear and fatigue into a distant corner of her mind while concentrating on navigation, terrain, and basic survival tasks. Her first obstacle came in the form of a small canyon. To bypass it, she had to climb jagged rocks, her boots scraping against sharp edges. She felt every cut, every abrasion, but her focus never wavered. Her knife, strapped to her side, wasn't just a weapon. It was a tool for digging, cutting, and improvising. She examined every step, calculating the safest route, refusing to rush. Even minor injuries could become major problems in the desert, especially without water to clean wounds. Each careful movement became a silent dialogue between her and the unforgiving landscape. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Jessica found a patch of scrub to hide from direct sunlight. She lay down, pressing her chest against the ground, feeling the heat radiate up through the sand. Her mind drifted for a moment to her family, to quiet nights back home, to the safety of walls and running water. Those thoughts were dangerous, tempting her to despair, but she quickly recentered, repeating her mental mantra: survive, conserve, endure. Even in the desert's isolation, discipline was her lifeline. Around mid-afternoon, her first major test occurred. A sudden sandstorm, small but intense, roared across the plain. Jessica froze, assessing the situation. The wind whipped at her clothes, stinging her skin, flinging grit into every exposed area. She pressed herself low against a jagged rock, wrapping her jacket tightly around her face. Dust clawed at her eyes and throat, making every breath a struggle. Minutes passed like hours as the storm raged, her body trembling against both the wind and cold that followed the initial blast of heat. By the time it subsided, she was coated in sand, bruised from the minor debris the storm had hurled at her, and completely exhausted. The desert was quiet again, but Jessica felt the weight of isolation more profoundly than ever. Her throat was raw, her stomach hollow, and her limbs heavy with fatigue. She knew she could not linger here. The exercise demanded forward motion, no matter the toll. Rising slowly, she adjusted her pack and began moving again, this time with even more careful attention to energy conservation. Every step required calculation. How far could she go before resting? Where could she find shade in the dying hours of afternoon? She relied on her knowledge of terrain, studying shadows, rock formations, and distant ridges for clues. By late afternoon, dehydration began to show its true effects. Her mouth was dry to the point of pain, her lips cracked and bleeding slightly. Her vision occasionally blurred as the sun reflected off the sand. She chewed cautiously on a small ration bar, barely swallowing, trying to trick her body into thinking it had more sustenance than it did. Her energy reserves were dwindling, but she refused to let panic set in. The desert demanded mental toughness above all else, and she reminded herself of every training session, every tip, every survival lesson she had memorized over months of preparation. As the sun began to dip, casting long, jagged shadows across the dunes, Jessica found herself near a rocky outcrop that promised some shelter for the night. The air cooled slightly, a reprieve from the unrelenting heat, but her body had already endured hours of strain. She settled briefly, examining the area for safety, potential wildlife hazards, uneven surfaces, and the optimal spot for rest. She dug a shallow trench with her hands to create a small windbreak, positioning herself behind it. The desert was unforgiving, but for the first time that day, she allowed herself a moment to feel cautiously confident that she had made it through the day. Nightfall brought another set of challenges. Temperatures plummeted, leaving her chilled despite exhaustion. Jessica layered herself in clothing and fashioned a makeshift blanket from her pack liner, trying to retain heat. The stars above were vivid and beautiful, but they did nothing to soothe the reality of isolation. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the desert's noises, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of nocturnal insects, the occasional shifting of sand. Her body ached, but she knew this was temporary. The night was only a pause before the relentless testing of another day. By the end of her first brutal day, Jessica understood the desert's full capacity for cruelty and indifference. Every element, heat, terrain, isolation, dehydration, had combined to push her limits. Yet, despite the fatigue, she felt a quiet sense of achievement. She had navigated her first hours alone, survived without water, and avoided critical mistakes. The exercise was far from over, but she had endured the desert's first trial. And that endurance, she realized, would be the foundation for everything to come. The desert sun had reached its zenith, and Specialist Jessica Monroe felt as though the world itself was pressing down on her. Every inch of exposed skin burned under the unrelenting glare, the heat radiating from the sand like invisible waves of fire. She staggered across a narrow ridge, sweat pouring from her brow, soaking the back of her shirt. Her throat felt like sandpaper, her tongue dry and swollen, every gulp of air harsh and painful. The knife at her belt, her compass, and the tiny ration bars in her pack were no comfort against the vast, empty expanse around her. Her mind, once sharp and disciplined, began to fray under the oppressive heat. Rocks that were solid minutes ago seemed to shimmer and ripple, giving the illusion of pools of water in the distance. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a glint of a stream winding through the dunes, a mirage she had been trained to recognize, yet one her desperate mind desperately wished were real. She staggered toward it, only to collapse onto the scorching sand when the illusion dissolved into nothing but more sand and heat. Every step became a battle between the body and mind. Her legs ached with cramps, the heat sapping both energy and resolve. She pressed her palms to her thighs, rubbing them to stimulate circulation, trying to fight the creeping weakness that threatened to overwhelm her. Sweat streamed into her eyes, stinging, but she could not stop to wipe it away. Every movement was measured, a delicate balance of conserving energy and pressing forward. Dehydration was no longer a possibility. It was a reality creeping ever closer with each parched breath. By late morning, hallucinations began to dominate her perception. Shadows shifted in impossible ways. Rocks seemed to move, and distant hills appeared to ripple like liquid. Jessica blinked, rubbed her eyes, and shook her head, trying to convince herself that the desert wasn't playing tricks. Yet even as rational thought warned her, her senses betrayed her. Every shimmer, every flicker of color in the sand seemed to promise water, shade, or safety. Each false hope brought a crushing wave of disappointment, leaving her physically weaker and mentally more exhausted. The heat was relentless, and her body's survival mechanisms began to betray her in other ways. Her mouth, completely devoid of moisture, made swallowing painful, and even chewing a small energy bar felt like an impossible task. Her skin was raw from sunburn, and blisters began to form on her hands and feet from friction against the sand. Each movement triggered pain, yet she forced herself onward, understanding that stopping entirely was not an option. Her mind constantly cycled between problem-solving and self-motivation. Find shelter, conserve energy, keep moving. At midday, she spotted a rocky crevice in the distance, its shadow providing the first significant shade she had encountered. Crawling toward it, she felt her strength draining with every inch. Her body threatened to collapse, but she gritted her teeth, knowing that reaching that tiny pocket of shade could mean the difference between survival and succumbing to the desert's heat. Her hands scraped against jagged rocks, her knees burned with friction, but eventually, she collapsed into the relative coolness of the shadow. She pressed herself against the rock wall, letting the small reprieve wash over her. Even in the shade, Jessica's challenges continued. The temperature differential between the blazing sun and the cool rock created an almost disorienting effect. Sweat cooled rapidly, then dried too quickly, leaving her skin sticky and uncomfortable. Her stomach churned, protesting the lack of water and food. Her mind, desperate for a break, began constructing elaborate hallucinations. She saw figures moving in the sand, soldiers she recognized from previous deployments, and at one point even thought she heard the faint hum of helicopter rotors that weren't there. She closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, repeating the mantra she had learned: survive, conserve, endure. As the afternoon heat persisted, Jessica realized she needed to make a critical decision: remain in shade and risk further dehydration without movement, or press forward, risking exposure but potentially finding water, shelter, or higher ground. Her instincts screamed that motion was necessary. Slowly, she rose, legs trembling, sweat dripping into her eyes. Every step was calculated, her eyes scanning the terrain for hazards, her ears tuned to the faintest sounds of life or water. The desert tested not just her body, but her mind's ability to weigh risk against necessity under extreme stress. By late afternoon, hallucinations intensified. Rocks seemed to sprout shapes, shadows stretched like snakes across the sand, and she occasionally glimpsed what appeared to be small streams or green patches in the distance. All illusions, cruel tricks played by the sun and her dehydrated mind. Yet she could not allow herself to falter. She focused on breathing, counting her steps, and mentally reaffirming her objectives. Survive until nightfall, conserve energy, avoid injury, and maintain situational awareness. Each hallucination was a challenge to overcome, a test of mental fortitude as demanding as the sun's heat or the blistering sand. Her ration bars were nearly gone, and her body screamed for water that wasn't there. Jessica remembered a technique from training: chewing on small stones to stimulate saliva, slowing her dehydration slightly. It was a small, almost comical tactic in the face of the desert's enormity, but she clung to every tiny advantage. Her hands were blistered from gripping her knife, her feet raw from friction against sand and rocks. Fatigue gnawed at every muscle, yet she refused to stop. Every hallucination she endured, every agonizing step she took, became a victory over the desert itself. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows and bathing the sand in molten gold, Jessica reached the top of a small ridge. The view stretched endlessly, sand and rocks rolling into infinity. She paused, sweat pouring from her body, vision swimming with the desert's heat. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to acknowledge the enormity of what she had endured. Hours alone, dehydrated, hallucinating, yet still moving forward. She had survived the desert's first full day, her mind and body tested beyond ordinary limits. Nightfall promised both relief and danger. Temperatures would drop sharply, and the desert would transform into an equally hostile environment. But for now, Jessica allowed herself a fleeting sense of accomplishment. She had navigated mirages, endured hallucinations, and kept moving despite the extreme heat. The desert had tested her, and she had not failed. Her body was battered, her throat raw, but her spirit remained unbroken. She reminded herself that survival required more than physical endurance. It demanded mental fortitude, resilience, and unwavering focus. As she prepared for the coming night, Jessica reflected on the lessons the desert had already taught her. Trust instincts, conserve energy, and never underestimate the environment. She adjusted her pack, inspected her knife, and created a small, sheltered spot behind rocks for rest. Sleep would be difficult, and dehydration still threatened, but she had survived the desert's first brutal challenge. The hallucinations would fade, the sun would set, and she would endure, because giving up was not an option. The desert had begun to reveal its cruelty, but Jessica Monroe had already shown that she could endure, hallucinations and all. She was alone, tested, and exhausted, yet the first victory, surviving the heat and her mind's illusions, would fuel the days to come. The desert's heat had been relentless throughout the day, and by late afternoon, Specialist Jessica Monroe had begun to feel the first signs of fatigue that could no longer be ignored. Her lips were dry and cracked, her skin raw and sticky with sweat, and every step required conscious effort. She had endured hallucinations, scorching sand, and the cruel trickery of heat mirages, yet the desert seemed to be saving its most unforgiving trial for last, a sudden sandstorm that rose without warning, as though conjured by the desert itself to punish the unwary. The first sign was subtle, a faint whisper of wind at the ridge where she had paused, moving sand in swirling, almost delicate patterns. But in seconds, the whisper became a roar. Dust whipped across her skin, stinging like needles, while the wind threatened to knock her off balance. Jessica crouched low, pressing herself to the ground, trying to remain calm as the storm grew with terrifying speed. She wrapped her jacket tightly around her face, attempting to shield her eyes and mouth from the onslaught of grit and debris. Sand clung to every surface of her body. Her boots, already battered from the day's treacherous terrain, were quickly coated in a fine layer that made each step slippery and treacherous. Her hands, raw and blistered from gripping rocks and maneuvering her knife, felt the abrasiveness of the sand like 1,000 tiny knives. Breathing became almost impossible, each inhalation filled with grit that scraped her throat. Yet panic was not an option. Survival, she reminded herself, required discipline, patience, and careful planning, even in chaos. The storm intensified. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the desert transformed into a hellish landscape of brown clouds and jagged silhouettes. Rocks that had seemed so familiar moments before became distorted shapes, blending into the swirling chaos. Every instinct she had trained for now demanded immediate action. Jessica pressed against a large boulder, its jagged edge offering minimal protection. She dug her heels into the sand, bracing against the wind, her muscles trembling with exertion. The desert had become a living adversary, and she was in the eye of its fury. Her mind raced through possible solutions. She could not remain exposed, yet moving carried the risk of being disoriented and lost. She assessed the surrounding terrain for shelter, recalling small depressions in the sand, crevices between rocks, anything that could offer more than the flimsy protection of a single boulder. Each second felt like a minute, each gust of wind a reminder that the desert would not forgive even a single mistake. She dug shallow trenches to anchor herself and create a minor windbreak, pressing her body low and tight against the rock. Time stretched into an endless, grueling ordeal. The storm showed no signs of mercy, battering her relentlessly. Sand infiltrated every crevice of her clothing, stinging eyes, nostrils, and mouth. Her breath became short and ragged, and her energy reserves drained with alarming speed. Jessica's body screamed for water, for rest, for any form of relief, yet the desert offered none. She relied entirely on mental fortitude to keep her mind anchored in reality, reminding herself of every survival lesson she had ever learned. She was alone, exposed, and under siege by nature at its most brutal. Hours seemed to pass, though the sky remained a chaotic swirl of sand and light. Jessica's body trembled uncontrollably, exhaustion threatening to overtake her. She pressed her face into her jacket, inhaling as carefully as possible, trying to filter the sand from each breath. Her eyes watered so much that vision blurred, and her hands, raw and blistered, clawed at the sand to create any form of stability. She thought fleetingly of her family, her friends, and the life she had fought to protect. These thoughts, though painful, gave her strength. They reminded her that giving up was not an option. Amid the chaos, her training instincts kicked in. She stabilized herself by anchoring her pack straps and digging her fingers into crevices in the rock. She repositioned herself periodically, shifting slightly to avoid cramping or pinning herself under falling debris. Each decision, each movement, was measured, deliberate. The desert's fury demanded more than endurance. It demanded intelligence and strategy under extreme pressure. She reminded herself that many soldiers had failed this test not because of physical exhaustion, but because their minds had given out first. As evening approached, the storm began to subside slowly, the winds easing into a relentless, grinding murmur. The sand, however, remained everywhere, coating her body and clothing in a thick, suffocating layer. Every breath was gritty, every movement sticky and painful. Jessica coughed, clearing her throat, and took stock of her situation. She was exhausted, dehydrated, and in pain, but she had survived the storm. The desert had thrown everything at her, and yet she remained upright, unbroken in spirit. The aftermath of the storm revealed the desert in a transformed state. Dunes had shifted, rocks exposed or buried, trails she had marked erased. She had to navigate with heightened awareness, reorienting herself using the compass and distant ridges. The heat was fading, replaced by the cooler air of approaching night, but the threat had not ended. The desert, she knew, could be just as deadly in the darkness. She scouted a safer location, a small cluster of boulders providing partial shelter, and prepared for the coming night. Jessica set about creating a makeshift camp behind the boulders. She dug a shallow trench, positioning her body low to reduce exposure to the cooling wind. She wrapped herself tightly in her jacket, using sand as insulation where possible. Her rations were minimal, but she ate sparingly, knowing the energy would need to last. Each movement was careful, calculated to prevent injury while maximizing her limited energy. The desert had demanded everything, and she had delivered. Now she needed to survive the night. As darkness fell, the desert revealed its nighttime dangers. Temperatures plummeted sharply, leaving her chilled despite exhaustion. Shadows became deceptive, stretching and shifting across dunes, rocks, and crevices. Jessica focused on breathing, centering herself, and visualizing the tasks required to survive until sunrise. Every sound, the shifting sand, distant animals, the echo of wind through rock formations, was amplified in the quiet night. Her senses were hyper-aware, her mind balancing the thin line between alertness and exhaustion. By the end of the day, Jessica Monroe had endured what few could imagine. The desert had tested her physically, mentally, and emotionally. The sandstorm had stripped her of comfort, battered her body, and threatened to claim her mind, yet she had persevered. Each breath, each heartbeat, each step was a victory in the silent war between human will and nature's raw fury. She knew more challenges awaited: heat, dehydration, hallucinations, and the cruel isolation of the desert. But surviving this storm had strengthened her resolve. The desert had not defeated her, and that would be her greatest weapon in the days to come. The desert night was merciless. Specialist Jessica Monroe lay pressed against the rocks she had dug behind, her body trembling from exhaustion, cold, and lingering pain from the day's brutal sandstorm. Her clothes were stiff with sand, her lips cracked and bleeding, and every muscle ached as if she had been beaten. The first hours of night offered relative relief from the scorching sun, but the plummeting temperatures and sharp wind made survival just as critical. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and thirst clawed at her throat with unrelenting intensity. Her body had been stripped of energy, and every breath felt like fire in her dry lungs. Hours passed, slow and torturous. The stars above offered a silent beauty, but beauty was irrelevant. In the desert, beauty could not save a human being from dehydration or hypothermia. She tried to sleep in short bursts, curling into herself, pressing her hands over her mouth to conserve warmth. Each small noise, a shifting dune, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of insects, jolted her into alertness. The desert, though silent for most, became a cacophony of sounds in the mind of a soldier fighting to survive. As the night deepened, Jessica realized the harsh reality. Her chances of being found by her own unit were slim. The vastness of the desert and the chaotic aftermath of the sandstorm meant she could be hundreds of meters off course from any marked search paths. Her ration bars were nearly gone, and her waterless throat burned with every inhale. For the first time, the gravity of her isolation pressed fully upon her. She had survived countless physical challenges, but the mind and body had limits. Without intervention, she could not last another night. That was when she remembered the last resort she had tucked away months earlier, a single, bright red flare she had stashed in her boot during preparation for extreme emergencies. She had promised herself she would not use it unless survival depended on it. And now, trembling with fatigue, pain, and fear, she knew the time had come. The flare represented a gamble, a final desperate attempt to call for help in the endless desert night. She could not be sure anyone would see it, and yet, in her exhaustion, she clung to hope as fiercely as life itself. Her hands shook violently as she drew the flare from her boot. It felt impossibly heavy, though its actual weight was minimal. Every movement was a challenge. Her arms quivered, her fingers numb from cold, fatigue, and dehydration. She positioned the flare carefully, away from sand that could catch fire and too close to her body. Her mind raced through the instructions she had memorized. Strike the match, ignite the flare, and aim it toward the sky. The tiniest mistake could end her life instantly. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she took a deep, measured breath. The strike of the flare was almost ceremonial in its tension. A hiss and a spark erupted, the flare igniting with brilliant crimson light, streaking upward and cutting sharply through the darkness. Jessica's eyes watered from the intensity of the flame, and sand clung to her face as the heat radiated outward. She held her breath, watching as the light expanded above the desert floor, hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, would see it. For a moment, It felt surreal. The desert, silent and indifferent, now pierced by a lifeline of fiery red. Minutes stretched interminably. She waited, heart hammering, scanning the horizon through the glare of the flare. Her mind drifted, hallucinations returning despite exhaustion. Rocks shifted into the shapes of people. Shadows stretched like hands reaching for her. And for a terrifying moment, she imagined the desert itself responding to her plea. But she stayed focused, leaning on her training to separate fantasy from reality. She repeated quietly to herself, "Survive, conserve, endure." Each word reinforced the fragile thread, connecting her to life. Her energy was nearly spent. Legs trembling, lips cracked and bleeding, and lungs burning with every breath, she sank to the ground. Yet even in this critical moment, she maintained a shred of discipline. She monitored the flare, ensuring it remained vertical and visible, adjusting it when necessary to keep it piercing the darkness. She knew this single act could mean the difference between life and death. The desert had already tested her beyond endurance, and now she had thrown herself entirely into its hands, hoping for a miracle. Time crawled. The flare burned bright against the pitch-black desert, illuminating sand dunes, jagged rocks, and the distant horizon. The desert, which had seemed endless and unforgiving, suddenly felt smaller, somehow bridged by this solitary streak of light. Jessica's ears strained for the sound of approaching rotors, for any noise that signaled rescue. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the faint whistle of wind, sparked hope, only to be dismissed as false alarm moments later. Her nerves were taut, every sense honed in desperation. And then, faintly at first, a low thrum echoed across the desert. Jessica froze, heart leaping. It was not a hallucination. The sound grew louder, a rhythmic, mechanical vibration cutting through the night. She scrambled to her feet, waving her hands, the flare still blazing above her head. She stumbled across the sand, vision swimming. The desert suddenly transformed from an endless threat to a place of potential salvation. Her pulse raced, adrenaline surging through her exhausted body as hope surged alongside it. The low hum evolved into a definitive roar. Helicopter blades cut the night air, stirring up dust and sand in swirling vortices. Jessica's knees buckled, but she pushed forward, waving the flare with every ounce of strength she had left. The rotor's shadows danced across the dunes, massive and terrifying, yet thrilling, a sign that she was no longer alone. She felt a mix of disbelief, relief, and pure joy as the helicopter drew closer, its spotlight piercing the darkness and locking on to her desperate figure. Moments later, a Navy SEAL lowered himself from the helicopter, harness in hand. Jessica's body shook uncontrollably, not from fear, but from relief, exhaustion, and the adrenaline still surging through her veins. "We've got you," he shouted over the roar of the rotors, wrapping the harness securely around her. Her arms trembled as she clung to him, barely able to comprehend that she was finally being rescued. Within minutes, she was lifted off the sand, the desert falling away beneath her as the helicopter ascended. Inside, medics greeted her with 4 fluids and blankets. Her body shivered violently, but for the first time, she felt an overwhelming sense of safety. The desert had tested her in every conceivable way: heat, hallucinations, dehydration, and isolation. She had survived. Her mind, stretched to the limits, had maintained focus long enough for a single, desperate act, the flare, to bring salvation. Exhaustion overwhelmed her, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to collapse fully into relief, knowing that she had endured the desert's wrath. As the helicopter carried her away, Jessica looked down at the desert floor. Endless sand stretched into infinity, dunes casting long shadows in the light of the flare, still faintly glowing below. It had been brutal, merciless, and unforgiving, yet she had survived through grit, ingenuity, and a willingness to act decisively in the moment of ultimate desperation. The desert had pushed her to the edge of human endurance, and she had stood firm. Her flare had been a small streak of red in a vast, indifferent landscape, yet it had bridged the gap between death and survival. The desert night stretched endlessly, silent and indifferent. When Specialist Jessica Monroe first heard it, a faint thrum that seemed almost imagined at first. Her body was numb from exhaustion, muscles trembling from dehydration, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the day. Yet her ears, strained and desperate for any sign of life, recognized the sound for what it was: helicopter blades. At first, she hesitated, unsure if her mind was playing tricks on her again, but the vibration in the sand beneath her feet confirmed it. Someone had heard her flare. Her heart leapt, a wild, uncontainable force that surged through every tired vein. She stumbled to her feet, the sand clinging to her sweat-slicked skin, and waved her arms as high as she could. The flare in her hand still burned bright, a crimson beacon against the ink-black desert, and she shook it violently, shouting at the top of her lungs despite her parched throat. For hours she had been alone, trapped in a cruel wilderness that mocked every effort. And now salvation was roaring across the dunes. The thrum grew louder, evolving into a deafening roar. Dust and sand whipped into the air as the helicopter descended, a monstrous silhouette cutting across the moonlight. Jessica's legs buckled from a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline, but she forced herself forward, eyes fixed on the descending craft. Every instinct screamed caution. She could not stumble, could not fall, could not waste a single moment. The helicopter was a lifeline, and she had to make herself visible, unmistakable, and reachable. As the helicopter drew nearer, the full scale of the desert's challenges became evident in the rotor's wind. Gusts kicked up clouds of sand, stinging her exposed skin and forcing her to shield her face. Her clothes, already caked in grit from hours of struggle, flapped violently in the gusts, and her boots sank into the sand with each step. Yet she pressed forward, driven by a single overwhelming thought: survival. The roar of the helicopter was now almost physical, shaking the ground beneath her feet, signaling both danger and salvation. A spotlight pierced the darkness, sweeping across the dunes, and Jessica knew she had been spotted. Relief surged through her, momentarily overwhelming her exhaustion. She waved the flare higher, shouting, her voice raw and cracked, yet carrying across the desert. Her mind raced, recalling every emergency protocol she had memorized, every training drill she had endured, every instruction about how to signal for extraction. She had one chance, and she would not waste it. Moments later, a Navy SEAL descended from the helicopter, harness in hand. Jessica's knees buckled, nearly giving out, but she lunged forward, gripping the straps with trembling hands. "We've got you," he shouted over the roar, the words barely audible yet profound in their significance. His presence was a surreal contrast to the desert's harsh silence, a tangible proof that her flare had worked, that her desperation had been answered. She felt tears sting her eyes, a mix of relief, disbelief, and overwhelming exhaustion. The SEAL secured her in the harness, adjusting straps around her chest and legs with precision. Her muscles trembled violently as she clung to him, barely able to comprehend the reality of the situation. She was no longer alone. She was no longer at the mercy of the desert's cruelty. Yet the transition from danger to relief did not happen instantly. The helicopter lifted slowly, each foot of elevation dragging her away from the sand she had fought so hard to endure. Her senses were still hyper-alert, scanning for threats, anticipating danger, even as exhaustion threatened to pull her under. Inside the helicopter, medics immediately attended to her. 4 fluids were administered, blankets wrapped around her shivering body, and her vitals were checked with meticulous care. Her lips cracked, skin raw and bleeding in places, and her eyes wide from dehydration and fatigue. But she was alive. Every beep of the monitors, every movement of the medics, every hum of the engines overhead was a testament to her survival, a stark contrast to the desert's indifference. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of safety. As the helicopter climbed higher, leaving the dunes behind, Jessica's mind replayed every moment that had led to this rescue. She remembered the sunburn, the hallucinations, the sandstorm, and the crushing isolation. She remembered the flare, that single desperate act that had bridged the gap between life and death. Each memory was vivid, etched into her body and mind, a record of endurance, courage, and unyielding resolve. She understood, more than ever, that survival had demanded not just strength, but intelligence, patience, and sheer willpower. The medic spoke softly, asking routine questions, assessing her condition, but Jessica could barely focus. Her thoughts were with the desert she was leaving behind, a landscape that had tested her in every imaginable way. Yet she felt a quiet triumph. She had endured heat, hallucinations, dehydration, and isolation. She had survived a sandstorm, navigated treacherous terrain, and signaled for help in the most desperate of circumstances. The desert had demanded everything, and she had delivered. Through the helicopter's open doors, she glimpsed the dunes stretching into infinity below, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The desert, indifferent and vast, had been her adversary and her teacher. It had stripped her of comfort, safety, and certainty, leaving her raw, exposed, and tested beyond ordinary limits. And yet, she had survived. The roar of the helicopter, the SEAL's precise actions, and the comfort of medical care marked the first step away from that brutal test, the first sign of human connection after days of solitary struggle. As the helicopter approached the base, Jessica allowed herself a deep, shuddering breath. Relief washed over her in waves, mingled with exhaustion and the lingering adrenaline from the rescue. The desert's lessons were still fresh in her mind, each hardship etched into memory, the hallucinations, the sandstorm, the relentless heat, the blistering terrain. She had endured more than many could imagine, and now she was safe. Her survival was not only a testament to her physical endurance, but to the mental fortitude that had carried her through the desert's unrelenting trials. The moment the helicopter touched down, Jessica stepped out, supported by medics and SEALs alike. Each step was measured, careful, as her body had been pushed to its absolute limits. She looked back at the desert, a silent expanse that had been both enemy and proving ground. The red flare, still faintly glowing in memory, had been her lifeline, a desperate act that ensured she would not be claimed by the unforgiving landscape. Relief, gratitude, and a quiet pride settled over her. She had survived. For Jessica Monroe, the desert was no longer a place of endless suffering. It was a testament to human resilience, courage, and determination. Every step she had taken, every hallucination endured, every moment of fear and exhaustion had led to this: the roar of a helicopter above, the precise skill of the SEALs, and the undeniable truth that she had overcome impossible odds. She was exhausted, dehydrated, and battered, but she was alive. And in the stark contrast between the desert's cruelty and the helicopter's salvation, she felt an unshakable sense of accomplishment. The helicopter's engines roared above the desert, a protective shield of sound and wind, carrying specialist Jessica Monroe away from the relentless landscape that had tested her limits. Inside the aircraft, the SEALs and medics worked with precision, their movements efficient and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos she had endured outside. Every gesture was rehearsed, every action deliberate. 4 fluids were inserted, blankets draped over her trembling shoulders, and vital signs checked meticulously. The cool interior of the helicopter was a stark contrast to the scorching desert, yet the sudden shift brought new sensations that made her body shudder uncontrollably. Jessica lay back against the cushioned seat, her body sore, blistered, and utterly exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept her upright for days began to fade, leaving a hollow, trembling fatigue that threatened to pull her under. The medics noticed immediately, gently adjusting the foregrip and monitoring her breathing. "You're going to be fine," one of them said softly, though Jessica barely had the energy to respond. She nodded weakly, too drained to speak, yet relief coursed through her veins, stronger than exhaustion. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe that she was safe. Her mind, still sharp despite the physical toll, began replaying the last 72 hours in fragmented images. The burning sun, hallucinations of water and shelter, the sandstorm that had nearly overtaken her, and the desperate flare she had ignited as her last hope. Each memory was vivid, almost cinematic, as she realized just how close she had come to succumbing to the desert's fury. But alongside the fear and pain was a quiet pride, a recognition that her training, endurance, and quick thinking had carried her through. She had survived where so many might have faltered. The SEAL who had hoisted her into the helicopter remained near, monitoring her carefully. His presence was reassuring, a constant reminder that she was no longer alone. He checked her straps, ensured she was secure, and spoke calmly, explaining each procedure as it happened. Jessica focused on his voice, clinging to the normalcy it represented. Each word, each movement of care, reinforced the stark contrast between the desert's chaos and the controlled efficiency of her rescuers. She felt the tension in her muscles ease slightly, replaced by the faint warmth of safety and human connection. The flight back to the base was long, and Jessica had little energy to occupy her mind. She lay quietly, listening to the hum of the engines and the muted conversations of the SEALs around her. Occasionally, one would check her vitals or ask if she could swallow water, and she would nod or shake her head. Her body was in shock, her muscles aching from dehydration and exposure, yet her mind remained alert, absorbing every detail. She thought about the desert she had left behind, the endless dunes, the harsh sun, and the unforgiving sandstorms, and felt a strange mixture of relief and reverence. It had been a brutal adversary, yet it had also taught her more about herself than any classroom or training exercise ever could. When the helicopter finally touched down at the base, Jessica felt the solid ground beneath her feet for the first time in days. The sensation was almost foreign, so simple, so ordinary, yet it was profoundly comforting. She stepped out, assisted by SEALs and medics, feeling every sore joint and blistered foot with acute awareness. The desert had left its mark on her body, red, raw skin, blistered hands and feet, cracked lips, and sunburn that covered exposed surfaces. Yet despite the physical toll, there was a spark of triumph in her eyes. She had endured the desert, and she had survived. At the base, she was guided to a medical tent, where a team of medics prepared to assess her fully. Blood pressure was taken, vitals monitored, and hydration administered intravenously. She drank small sips of water, careful not to overwhelm her dehydrated system, and allowed the cool blankets to wrap around her like a protective cocoon. Her body shook with both relief and residual adrenaline, but she let it happen, understanding that this was part of recovery. She had pushed herself to the edge of human endurance, and now her body was beginning the slow, deliberate process of healing. The SEALs who had accompanied her offered quiet words of encouragement and reassurance, recounting how precise her flare had been and how it had made her location visible against the vast, dark desert. Jessica listened, absorbing the praise without vanity, recognizing that every survival tactic she had employed, the rationing, the navigation, the flare, had contributed to her rescue. Each strategy, each moment of presence of mind, had been a deliberate act of survival. In those quiet hours, she reflected on how fragile life could be, and how even the smallest decisions, like the angle at which she held her flare, or the pace at which she moved could determine life or death in the harshest conditions. As she rested, her thoughts returned to the hallucinations she had endured in the desert heat. Rocks that had shifted and moved, distant mirages of water and vegetation, shadows that seemed alive. All had been terrifying, yet they had also taught her something invaluable about the human mind under extreme stress. She realized that survival was not merely about physical endurance, but about mastering fear, controlling perception, and maintaining focus when every instinct screamed otherwise. The desert had tested not only her body, but her mind, and she had passed. The medics allowed her a moment of solitude, and Jessica sat quietly, feeling the blankets around her, the four in her arm, and the steady, reassuring hum of activity around her. She closed her eyes, letting the reality of her rescue sink in. She had faced dehydration, heat exhaustion, hallucinations, and a sandstorm that threatened to bury her. She had survived alone for days, relying on nothing but her training, ingenuity, and willpower. And now she was safe, surrounded by people who understood the gravity of her ordeal and who could ensure her recovery. Even as she rested, Jessica's mind was active, replaying her steps, assessing what had worked and what could have been improved. Survival, she realized, was both art and science. Every decision, every movement, every bit of knowledge applied with precision. She made mental notes, better hydration strategies, more precise rationing, techniques for handling hallucinations, and ways to signal for help even more effectively. The desert had been harsh, but it had been a masterful teacher, and she had absorbed its lessons fully. Hours later, as she lay on a cot with the warmth of the blankets finally seeping into her aching muscles, she felt a profound gratitude. The SEAL's precision, the medic's care, and her own perseverance had converged to save her life. She had survived the desert, a landscape indifferent to human suffering, and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The experience would remain etched in her memory forever, a testament to human endurance, ingenuity, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. In the quiet moments that followed, Jessica reflected on what it meant to truly survive. She had endured isolation, extreme environmental conditions, and the constant threat of physical collapse. She had faced hallucinations and fear, yet she had maintained clarity of thought, executed her survival plan, and called for rescue with perfect timing. Each of these elements had been crucial, and together they had brought her safely back from the brink. She understood now, more than ever, that survival required not just physical stamina, but mental resilience, careful planning, and an unyielding will to live. As dawn broke over the base, Jessica felt a sense of closure and accomplishment. The desert lay behind her, vast, silent, and unyielding, yet she had conquered it. Her body would heal, her mind would process the ordeal, and her spirit would carry the lessons learned for the rest of her life. She had survived the unimaginable, and in that survival, she had discovered a new depth of strength and resilience within herself. The sun rose slowly over the military base, casting pale gold light across the desert beyond. Specialist Jessica Monroe lay on a cot inside the medical tent, wrapped in layers of blankets, her body finally beginning to respond to the four fluids and the careful attention of the medics. Her muscles, stiff and bruised from the harsh environment, relaxed slightly under the gentle warmth of the morning sun. For the first time since the helicopter lifted her from the sand, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, letting the reality of her survival settle fully into her consciousness. The desert no longer loomed in her mind as a place of terror. Instead, it existed as a powerful memory, etched vividly into her mind. The blinding heat, the endless dunes, the shifting rocks, and the sandstorms that had challenged her at every turn. Every hallucination, every pang of thirst, and every ache in her body became part of a story she had endured, a narrative of resilience, courage, and tenacity. Jessica's heart swelled with a quiet pride. She had faced the desert in its most brutal state, tested her body and mind beyond conventional limits, and emerged victorious. The SEALs who had rescued her visited periodically, checking her condition and offering quiet words of encouragement. They recounted the precision of her flare, the determination she had shown, and how her quick thinking had made the extraction possible. Jessica listened intently, absorbing each word. In their voices, she heard admiration, yes, but also affirmation, the confirmation that she had not just survived, but had excelled under extreme duress. Her flare had been a single, desperate act of ingenuity, and it had bridged the impossible gap between isolation and salvation. As the day wore on, Jessica began reflecting not just on the mechanics of her survival, but on the emotional journey she had undertaken. Fear, isolation, and exhaustion had been her constant companions in the desert, and yet she had learned to channel these forces into focus. Panic had threatened to undo her. Hallucinations had tried to deceive her, and the relentless heat had pushed her physical limits. But she had endured. She realized that survival had demanded more than physical stamina. It had required mastering her own mind, controlling fear, and maintaining unwavering determination. The medics allowed her to sit up, sip water slowly, and nibble on small portions of food. Each mouthful was a reminder of the fragility and value of life. The sensation of water sliding down her dry throat, of nourishment settling in her aching stomach, was almost euphoric. Jessica closed her eyes, savoring each simple pleasure that the desert had denied her for so long. She realized that these ordinary sensations, warmth, hydration, safety, were now precious. Reminders that even the smallest comforts could be extraordinary in the aftermath of extreme survival. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, but the perception had changed. Once it had been a cruel, indifferent expanse. Now it was a landscape that had tested her, taught her, and shaped her. She thought of every decision she had made. Rationing energy, managing hallucinations, navigating dunes, enduring a sandstorm, and igniting the flare that had called her rescuers. Each choice had been critical, each action deliberate. And now, looking back, she recognized that survival was not merely a matter of endurance. It was an art, a precise balance of strategy, courage, and adaptability. The SEALs debriefed her, asking her to recount every detail of the ordeal. Jessica spoke carefully, each memory vivid, each sensation relived as she described the heat, hallucinations, dehydration, and isolation. They listened with professional focus, occasionally offering technical guidance or advice, but mostly allowing her narrative to unfold. Through their questions, she understood that her experience would become part of training, a real-life example of human resilience and ingenuity under extreme circumstances. Her story, once a personal battle, was now a lesson for others, a demonstration of how preparation, mental fortitude, and courage could triumph even against the harshest conditions. As afternoon arrived, Jessica allowed herself to process the emotional weight of her survival. Relief had been immediate upon the helicopter's arrival, but the true impact of her ordeal only now began to settle. Gratitude, pride, and an almost spiritual sense of accomplishment mingled with lingering exhaustion. She understood that surviving the desert had not only tested her body and mind, but had fundamentally reshaped her perspective on life, strength, and determination. Every step she had taken, every hallucination endured, and every sleepless hour of vigil had contributed to a transformation that would remain with her forever. The final lesson, Jessica realized, was humility. The desert had been indifferent, a force of nature that could neither be controlled nor fully understood. She had survived, not because the environment had spared her, but because she had respected its dangers, prepared for its cruelty, and adapted with intelligence and courage. She had faced the abyss of human vulnerability and walked away, changed but unbroken. The flare, The lone act of desperation symbolized the delicate balance between hope and action, demonstrating that survival often requires both courage and calculated risk. As night approached again, Jessica sat quietly outside the tent, wrapped in blankets, gazing toward the horizon. The desert beyond the base remained vast and silent, unchanged and relentless. Yet her perception had shifted. Where once she had seen only danger, she now saw challenge, opportunity, and proof of her own resilience. She reflected on the hallucinations, the sandstorm, and the relentless sun, realizing that each had been a test of willpower as much as physical endurance. She understood that true survival demanded mastery of both mind and body, an unyielding determination to act decisively, and the courage to trust oneself in the most extreme circumstances. In those quiet moments, she also contemplated the future. Her desert ordeal would inform every mission, every decision, and every challenge she faced from this point forward. The lessons she had learned, preparation, adaptability, patience, and mental resilience, were now ingrained in her being. Jessica felt an unshakable confidence, tempered by humility, knowing that she had experienced something few could endure, and that the knowledge she carried would be invaluable in any situation. As she finally allowed herself to rest fully, the desert seemed to recede in her mind, no longer a looming threat, but a testament to human resilience. The roar of the helicopter, the precise care of the SEALs, the intense solitude, and the brilliance of the flare all blended into a narrative of triumph. Specialist Jessica Monroe had faced one of nature's most unforgiving environments, tested beyond conventional limits, and emerged alive, wiser, and stronger. She had survived, not just by chance, but through intelligence, courage, and unwavering willpower. In the silence of the desert night, now observed from the safety of the base, she understood the profound truth of her experience. Survival was a combination of preparation, action, and mental strength. Every obstacle she had encountered had been a lesson, every hallucination a challenge to her focus, and every painful step a testament to her resilience. She had endured the unimaginable, and in doing so, discovered the depths of her own strength. Specialist Jessica Monroe closed her eyes as the final rays of sunset faded, allowing herself a deep, shuddering breath. The desert, with all its cruelty and beauty, had tested her beyond measure. And she had triumphed.